Welcome to the Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing, or as we like to call it,
How to sell a sandwich without accidentally starting a cult.
Welcome back to the Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing, the podcast for people who opened 17 tabs on innovation and aren't entirely sure any of them were the point. I'm your host, Sean Makin, a man prone to overthinking, not just the big decisions, but also the small ones, like whether this introduction should have been shorter. Before we begin, a small suggestion. You may wish to pause this episode and prepare yourself something to drink. Not something simple, something that requires multiple steps, at least one decision you're entirely qualified to make, and a level of effort that feels disproportionate to the outcome. A coffee involving terminology you don't normally use is ideal. Once you've done that, find somewhere comfortable to sit, not super comfortable, just comfortable enough that you can relax, but not so comfortable that you fall asleep. We'll wait. Good, you're back. Today we are talking about innovation. Not the kind that gets noticed with dramatic music and a keynote speaker wearing a turtleneck, but the kind that quietly determines whether your business grows or slowly that becomes a cautionary tale told at networking events. Because here's the thing, innovation isn't optional, it's not a buzzword, it's not even particularly glamorous. It's just necessary.
Episode 10, Unleashing Innovation, or
Why your best idea is probably sitting in a meeting you didn't attend.
Let's begin with the myth, because innovation as a concept has been somewhat over-marketed. It's been polished, packaged, and presented as a sort of business superpower. Something that arrives in a flash of brilliance, preferably during a shower, a walk, or a moment of intense staring out of a window while holding a coffee. Ideally, it also involves a dramatic soundtrack, but in reality, innovation is rarely like that. In fact, most innovation does not arrive with a bang. It arrives quietly, often disguised as a small improvement, a slightly better question, or a vague sense that something is, unnecessarily complicated, which, if we're being honest, describes quite a lot of business operations. There is also a persistent belief that innovation belongs to a select group of people. You know the type. They have job titles that didn't exist 10 years ago, a worrying number of sticky notes, and an air of calm confidence that suggests they've already thought of something you haven't. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Innovation is not a department. It's not something that happens in a glass-walled room with beanbags and a whiteboard that still has writing on it from 2017. It's something that happens everywhere, or not at all. Because the real barrier to innovation isn't a lack of ideas, it's a lack of permission. Permission to question existing processes, suggest alternatives, and occasionally say, "This doesn't make sense," without it becoming a career-limiting move. And this is where things get interesting, because most organisations don't actively discourage innovation. They just unintentionally design systems that make it difficult. For example, you might say you value new ideas, but if every suggestion requires 3 approvals, a formal proposal, and a meeting to schedule another meeting, then what you actually value is endurance, not innovation. And so, innovation gets filtered. Not by quality, but by persistence. Only the most determined ideas survive. Which sounds admirable until you realise that many excellent ideas are quietly abandoned somewhere between
"That's interesting"
and
Let's revisit this next quarter.
which in business terms is roughly equivalent to sending something into a black hole. There is also an issue of scale. Because when people think about innovation, they tend to think big.
Transformational, disruptive, industry-changing.
But most meaningful innovation is smaller. It's incremental. It's the accumulation of better decisions, smarter processes, and continuous refinement. It's less revolution and more relentless improvement, which is admittedly harder to put on a keynote slide. And yet, these small changes compound. Over time, they become competitive advantage, operational efficiency, and occasionally something that looks like brilliance in hindsight, which is important because hindsight is where innovation always looks obvious. Of course, none of this is particularly glamorous. There are no dramatic unveilings, no standing ovations, just a steady process of making things better. So if you're waiting for innovation to arrive as a single perfect idea, you may be waiting for a while. Because if you start looking for it in the everyday, in the processes, conversations, frustrations, and small improvements, you'll find that it's already there, quietly doing its job, waiting for someone to notice.
Part 2. Culture or why ideas die in meetings.
Now, having dismantled the myth of innovation, we arrive at the place where most ideas go to rest. Culture. Or more specifically, organisational culture, which is often described in very uplifting terms like dynamic, collaborative, or the ever-popular forward thinking. And yet, somehow still manages to make suggesting a new idea feel like attempted return soup in a restaurant. Because culture isn't what's written on the wall. It's what happens in the room. It's the reaction someone gets when they say, "I've been thinking." And that reaction tells you everything. In a genuinely innovative culture, that sentence is followed by curiosity, questions, exploration, possibly even enthusiasm. In most organisations, it's followed by silence, mild concern, or someone saying,
"Have we tried what we did last year?"
Which, to be fair, is a perfectly reasonable question. If your goal is consistency or nostalgia or slowly becoming irrelevant, the problem is not that people lack ideas, it's that they've learned, often very efficiently, that sharing them is risky. Because somewhere along the way, they've seen what happens when someone speaks up. They've seen ideas dismissed too quickly, suggestions overanalyzed into oblivion, or worse, politely acknowledged then quietly ignored. And after a while, people adapt. They stop offering their ideas, not because they don't have them, but because they've done the maths. And the maths says,
effort plus risk minus recognition equals silence.
There is, of course, a very specific moment when this transformation happens. It's usually in a meeting about innovation. If you've never attended a meeting about innovation, it's quite an experience. It begins with enthusiasm. Someone says,
"We need to think differently."
Everybody nods. There may be biscuits. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the meeting evolves into a detailed discussion about why things are the way they are, why changing them would be difficult, and why now might not be the right time. By the end, nothing has changed. Well, except for the biscuits are gone. And everyone agrees to circle back. No one knows what that means, but it does sound productive. This is where many organisations get stuck because they believe that they've created a culture of innovation when what they've actually created is a culture of approval, where ideas are welcome as long as they are fully formed, completely safe, and already aligned with what the leadership was thinking anyway. Which is less innovation and more agreeing, but creatively. Real innovation requires something much less comfortable. It requires psychological safety, which sounds like a term invented by someone with a flip chart, but is actually very simple. It means people can share ideas, challenge assumptions, and occasionally be wrong without it becoming a defining moment in their professional biography. Because here's the thing about new ideas, most of them aren't perfect. In fact, many of them are, well, slightly awkward. Incomplete, unpolished, occasionally impractical, and that is fine. That's the point. But if your culture only rewards polished ideas, you'll only ever hear from people who are very confident or very good at PowerPoint. And then there's failure, a word that tends to make organisations uncomfortable, which is understandable. Failure is inconvenient. It disrupts plans, it affects budget, it occasionally requires explaining things to other people. But here's the paradox. If failure is not allowed, innovation is not possible. So if innovation feels slow or difficult or strangely absent, it's worth asking a simple question. Not, do we have any good ideas, but what happens when someone shares one? Because that answer is your culture.
Part 3. Customers, they know things, annoyingly.
Next, customers. Now, customers are fascinating, not just in the way that all human behaviour is fascinating, but in a very specific way. They will tell you exactly what they want, ignore half of what you say, and then use your product in a way that you had not anticipated but would have confidently said was impossible. And yet, despite this, they are your most viable source of innovation, which is mildly inconvenient because it means the answers you're looking for are already out there, being expressed in feedback, complaints, reviews, support tickets, and the occasional email that begins with,
I'm not usually one to complain, but
which is universally recognised as a sign that someone is very much about to complain. The challenge, of course, is listening. Not the polite, performative kind of listening, but the slightly uncomfortable kind. The kind where you hear something and think, that's not how this is supposed to work. Because customers have a remarkable ability to highlight the gap between what you intended and what actually happens, which can be educational. Hidden inside that gap are opportunities. Opportunities to improve, simplify, rethink, or occasionally admit that something you spent 6 months building is confusing to everyone except the people who built it. There is, incidentally, a very specific lifestyle to customer feedback within an organisation. It usually goes something like this. First, the feedback arrives. It is read. It is acknowledged. Someone says,
That's interesting.
Then it's placed into a document, or a system, or in particularly advanced organisations, a shared folder. At this point, it's very important that the feedback is correctly labelled and possibly colour-coded. This gives everyone a reassuring sense that something is happening. Eventually, the feedback is scheduled for discussion, often in a meeting about improvement, which may or may not include biscuits. By this stage, the biscuits have become a critical metric, because if the quality of biscuits improves, but the product does not, you're not innovating, you're catering. The point is, collecting feedback is not the same as using it. Many organisations are exceptionally good at collecting it. They have surveys, dashboards, metrics, reports, entire ecosystems dedicated to understanding the customer, and yet, somehow, still manage to ignore the part where the customer explains the problem. Real innovation happens when you close that gap, when feedback doesn't just sit in a system but actively shapes decisions, when patterns are recognised, when reoccurring frustrations are not treated as inconveniences but as signals, because customers don't always describe solutions. In fact, they rarely do. They describe experiences, problems, friction, moments where something doesn't quite work.
It makes my cat scream whenever I switch it on.
And that's where innovation begins. Not with the answer, but with the question, why is this difficult? The most effective businesses build systems around this. They regularly review feedback, share it across teams, and crucially act upon it. Not once, not occasionally, but consistently, because nothing erodes trust faster than asking for feedback, then doing absolutely nothing with it. And when you act on it, something interesting happens. Customers notice. They feel heard, they engage more, and perhaps most usefully, they keep telling you things. Which means more feedback, which means more opportunities, which means potentially more meetings. So if you find yourself in a room discussing customer insights and someone reaches for a biscuit, just pause for a moment. Ask yourself, are we about to improve something or simply consume yet another digestive in quiet disagreement? Because innovation doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from paying attention to what your customers are already telling you, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient.
Part 4. Technology, or stop panicking about AI.
Now let's talk about technology, which in any modern discussion about innovation appears roughly 3 minutes in wearing a slightly urgent expression, usually introduced with a sentence like,
We should probably be doing something with AI.
This is often followed by a pause. Not a thoughtful pause, more of a collective uncertainty pause, where everybody in the room is quietly hoping someone else knows what that means. Because, as we discussed in previous episodes, technology has developed a reputation for being both extremely powerful and slightly mysterious, which is an impressive combination. And so organisations respond in one of two ways. They either ignore it completely and hope it goes away, or attempt to adopt it immediately without being entirely sure what problem it's solving. This second approach is particularly popular. It involves purchasing new tools, attending webinars, and using phrases like
Leveraging AI capabilities
in meetings, often while quietly Googling what those capabilities are. Now, to be clear, technology is important. It enables innovation. It helps businesses move faster, analyse more data, automate repetitive tasks, and generally reduce the number of things humans have to do that make them sigh heavily at their desks. But technology is a tool, not a strategy, and this is where things often go wrong, because buying technology does feel like progress. It looks like action. There are logins, dashboards, possibly even a training session. There is in fact a very specific phrase every organisation goes through after adopting new technology. It begins with enthusiasm. People say things like,
This is going to change everything.
then comes exploration. Buttons are clicked, features are discovered, someone finds a testing that no one else understands but everyone agrees is powerful. After that comes confusion, followed closely by selective usage. Eventually the organisation settles into a steady rhythm of using approximately 10% of the tool's actual capability, while continuing to pay for 100% of it.
worth every penny.
At which point the technology quietly joins the others in what can only be described as a sort of digital cupboard. Not unlike the plate of biscuits at the innovation meeting. Always present, occasionally useful, but not in themselves a solution to anything. The real value of technology comes from alignment, from asking, what are we trying to achieve? Where are the inefficiency? And how can the technology help us do this better? Because when technology is applied with purpose, it becomes powerful. It speeds up decision making, improves customer insight, enhances communication, and frees up time for more valuable work. And when it's applied without clarity, it becomes noise. Another system, another login, another thing that we should be probably using more. There's also a subtle misconception that technology creates innovation. It doesn't. People create innovation. Technology supports it. If you take a disorganized process and apply advanced technology to it, you don't get innovation. You get a faster, more efficient version of the same problem. Which is why the most effective organizations don't start with technology. They start with problems, opportunities, and outcomes, and then ask, what tools will help us get there? So yes, explore AI, adopt new tools, stay curious about what's possible, but don't confuse having technology with using it well, because innovation doesn't come from the tool itself, it comes from what you choose to do with it, preferably before the biscuits run out.
Ew, someone's taken the last jammy dodger.
Part 5. Collaboration. Or you don't know everything.
Now, we arrive at collaboration, which is a polite way of saying you're going to need other people. This can be, well, challenging, because most organisations like to believe they're entirely self-sufficient, that somewhere within their structure, possibly in a department no one fully understands, all the answers already exist. And to be fair, they might. They're just, not always speaking to each other, because collaboration in practice is not simply about putting people in the same room. That's what's called a meeting. And we've already established how those tend to go. Real collaboration is about different perspectives, shared problem solving, and the slightly uncomfortable process of discovering that someone else has a better idea, which, while useful, is not always immediately celebrated. But this is where innovation accelerates, at the intersection of different disciplines, different experiences, and different ways of thinking, because when ideas collide, something new emerges. Of course, there is a very specific stage in collaboration where things become, well, interesting. It's usually about halfway through a project. At this point, one team has a plan, another team has a different plan, and a third team has been quietly working on something entirely unrelated which may actually solve the problem. This is something referred to as alignment, though in practice it more closely resembles a polite negotiation between competing realities. And then there are the external collaborations, Partnerships, agencies, specialists, people who exist outside your organisations and therefore have a distinct advantage of not entirely being accustomed to how things are normally done, which means they ask questions, simple ones like,
Why do you do it this way?
and suddenly everyone is very busy looking at the notes, because fresh perspective is wonderful. It challenges assumptions, it highlights inefficiency, it introduces ideas that might not emerge internally. It also occasionally introduces chaos. But the useful kind. The most innovative organisations embrace this. They build partnerships, encourage cross-team collaboration, and create environments where ideas can move freely instead of being carefully contained within departmental boundaries. Because when collaboration works well, it reduces duplication, speeds up problem solving, and leads to better, more rounded solutions. When it doesn't work quite as well, it leads to something known as the collaborative meeting. This is a special kind of meeting. It involves multiple teams, multiple viewpoints, and at least one person saying,
I think we might be talking about different things.
There are usually diagrams with several arrows, none of which match, and inevitably biscuits. By this stage, the biscuits have taken on a new role. They are no longer just refreshments, they are emotional support. But even in these moments, particularly in these moments, there is value. Because friction, when managed well, creates clarity. It forces decisions, it surfaces assumptions, it moves things forward. The key is intention. Collaboration works when it is structured enough to be productive, open enough to encourage ideas, and focused enough to actually lead somewhere, preferably somewhere other than another meeting. So yes, you don't have to have all the answers, and that's not a weakness, it's an opportunity, because innovation doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when people share, challenge, combine, and build on others' thinking, and occasionally agree on something before the biscuits are gone.
Part 6. Learning, the long game.
Now let's talk about learning, which, unfortunately, is unavoidable, because innovation, despite all attempts to simplify it, is not a one-time event. It's not something you can schedule, complete, and then proudly file under Done. If it were, organisations would have solved it years ago, possibly in a workshop with an extensive PowerPoint deck and, naturally, biscuits. But innovation is a process, an ongoing, slightly unpredictable process of testing ideas, learning from outcomes, and adjusting accordingly. Which sounds straightforward until you actually try to do it consistently. Because learning requires something many organisations find, difficult. Admitting that what you did yesterday might not be the best approach today. Markets change, technology evolves, customers' expectations shift, and strategies that once worked perfectly well quietly stop working. Usually at the exact moment you become confident in them. The most innovative organisations recognise this. They build learning into the processes. They review performance regularly, analyse results honestly, and adapt quickly, not dramatically, not reactively, but continuously. This is particularly important for marketers, because marketing exists in a world where algorithms change without warning, trends appear overnight, and something you posted at 9:03 AM can be considered outdated by 9:17. It's one of the few professions where you can spend weeks planning a campaign, launch it confidently, and then discover that the platform has redesigned itself, or even worse, introduced a new feature which everybody else seems to understand immediately. And you find yourself in a meeting where someone says,
We should definitely be doing more of this.
no one knows how the feature works, but everybody agrees it's important. This is why learning matters. Because without it, you're not innovating, you're reacting. And reacting, while occasionally necessary, is not the same as evolving. True learning involves curiosity and experimentation, and also a willingness to challenge your own assumptions. It means asking what worked, what didn't, and why. It means looking at results, not as a verdict, but as information. Even when that information is slightly, disappointing. Because every test, every campaign, every initiative, successful or not, provides insight. And over time, those insights compound. They lead to better decisions, smarter strategies, and more efficient innovation. Of course, there is a temptation to skip this part, to move quickly from one idea to the next, to focus on doing rather than learning. But without learning, you're just repeating yourself, possibly with better biscuits, but repeating yourself nonetheless. So if innovation is the goal, learning is the mechanism. It's the thing that turns experience into insight, insight into action, and action into growth. And if you're a marketer, it's the only way to stay one step ahead of whatever changed while you were listening to this.
What on earth is a widgy social thrust bulker?
Part 7, Agility, or Stop Building Things for 18 months.
Now let's talk about agility, which is one of those words that sounds impressive until you try to define it in a meeting. Because agility in practice is not about moving quickly for the sake of it, it's about moving intelligently. It's about testing ideas early, learning from real world feedback, and adapting before you invested too much time, money, or emotional energy into something that may not work, which naturally runs directly counter to the very human instinct to plan everything in detail, commit fully, and then defend it at all costs. Traditional approaches to projects often sound like this. Months of planning, extensive documentation, multiple approvals, and a launch date that feels, well, significant. By the time it arrives, expectations are high, and then you launch, and immediately discover that something isn't quite right. Maybe the messaging doesn't land, maybe the customers respond differently than expected, maybe the market has shifted, or maybe someone notices a very obvious issue that no one saw during the previous 47 meetings and slide 14. This is where agility changes the game. Instead of building everything perfectly before launch, you start smaller, test earlier, and adjust continuously. You treat ideas not as finished products, but more as experiments. This is particularly relevant in marketing, because marketing has a long and proud tradition of overcommitting. For example, a team spends 3 months developing a campaign. There are strategy documents, creative concepts, messaging frameworks, and a presentation that includes one slide titled
Big idea.
The campaign launches, and within 48 hours the data reveals that the headline isn't working, the audience isn't responding, and the call to action has been interpreted in a way no one anticipated. At this point there are 2 options. Option 1, stay the course, because the plan has been approved and the budget has been allocated, and most importantly, there are still biscuits left from the launch meeting. Option 2, adapt, change the headline, refine the targeting, adjust the messaging. Agility is choosing option 2, because the reality is you don't learn anything meaningful until something meets the real world. And the real world is unpredictable. It does not read your strategy documents. It does not attend your planning meetings. It has no particular interest in your timelines. This is why agile organizations focus on speed of learning, flexibility, and responsiveness. They build feedback loops. They monitor performance. They adjust quickly, not because they enjoy change, but because they understand its value. Of course, there's a moment, usually during an agile process, when someone says,
"Should we pause and review this in a meeting?"
And suddenly everyone becomes very still, because they know what that means. There will be a discussion, a summary, and possibly a presentation, and inevitably not enough biscuits. But true agility avoids this trap. It keeps things moving. It prioritizes action over perfection, because innovation doesn't come from getting everything right the first time, it comes from trying, learning, and improving. So if your projects are taking too long, if your ideas feel stuck, if your plans are becoming more complex rather than effective, it might not be a lack of innovation, it might be a lack of agility, and possibly way too many meetings.
Part 8, Measurement. Yes, you have to track it.
Finally, measurement, which is the part of innovation that sounds the least exciting and is unfortunately the most important, because without measurement, innovation is not innovation, it's enthusiasm. And while enthusiasm is admirable, it's not on its own a reliable growth strategy. Measurement is what tells you what's working, what isn't, and whether your bold new idea is actually doing anything useful, which is information you will at some point need. The challenge is that measurement requires clarity. You need to define what success looks like, what metrics matter, and how you're going to track them. Ideally, before you launch something, though in practice, often slightly after. because it's very easy to get caught up in the excitement of a new initiative, a new campaign, a new product, a new direction. Everyone is aligned, there is energy, there is momentum, there might even be a meeting. And somewhere in that process, someone says,
This is going to work.
which is a lovely sentiment, but not a measurement strategy. This is particularly relevant for business owners because there's a very specific scenario that plays out in businesses of all sizes. A new campaign is launched. Time passes and eventually someone asks,
So, how's that doing?
at which point the answer is often,
Well, people seem to like it.
which is encouraging but also, vague. Because people seem to like it can mean increased engagement, more inquiries, higher sales, or a few positive comments, some polite nodding, and a general sense that no one wants to say anything negative. Without measurement, it's impossible to tell the difference. And this is where many businesses get stuck. They invest time, energy, and budget into innovation, but don't fully track the outcome, which means decisions are based upon assumptions, anecdotes, and the occasional strong opinion, usually expressed with great confidence. But innovation requires evidence. It requires data, analysis, and a willingness to adjust based on what you find, because sometimes the results will confirm your thinking, and sometimes they won't, which is where things become, character building. And this is the value of measurement. It removes guesswork. It provides clarity. It also allows you to double down on what works, improve what doesn't, and stop doing things that have no meaningful impact. And over time, this leads to better outcomes, more efficient innovation, and stronger business growth. Of course, there is one final stage in the measurement process. The results are reviewed. There is possibly a discussion, possibly a meeting, and yet another presentation, and inevitably biscuits. At this point, however, something has changed. The conversation is no longer about opinions, it's about evidence, and that's the difference. So yes, track your innovation, measure your results, define your success, because without that, you're not really growing. You're just, hoping. And hope, while powerful, is not a metric.
Part 9. The slightly philosophical bit.
So, what have we learned? Innovation isn't a single moment, a big idea, or a shiny piece of technology. It's a system, a culture, a slightly chaotic, ongoing process of trying things, learning things, and occasionally wondering why you didn't do this sooner. Because growth doesn't come from doing what worked yesterday. It comes from being brave. Being brave enough to try something better today. And if all else fails, just remember, somewhere in your organisation, someone already has a good idea. They're just waiting for a meeting where they won't be ignored. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and remember, innovation isn't about one brilliant idea. It's about noticing the small ones, testing them, learning from them, and occasionally surviving the meeting where they're discussed. Because growth doesn't come from doing what's comfortable, it comes from being just uncomfortable enough to try something better. And if all else fails, at least make sure the biscuits are worth it, because nothing else, that's the one area of innovation most organisations seem to take very seriously. Cheers.
The Overthinker's Guide to Modern Marketing is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, and most places where people go to think slightly more deeply while doing something else entirely.